regard croisé sur l'Iran, sur sa politique intérieure et régionale. Le colloque est organisé par la FEMO, qui ça veut dire Fondation pour l'étude du Moyen-Orient, qui consacre beaucoup de ses travaux aux problèmes de l'Iran, et par l'APA, qui est une association d'Iraniens en Europe. La FEMO vient de publier un livre qui traite d'un sujet très voisin, mais pas dans l'actualité absolue, puisqu'il est sorti déjà depuis un mois et demi, et dont le titre annonçait pratiquement le sujet de ce colloque. Mais certains des auteurs sont là, d'ailleurs. Vous pourrez éventuellement les questionner ou demander des détails par rapport à ce qu'ils ont écrit. Mais mon objet est simplement de lancer ce colloque en disant que nous allons consacrer donc notre temps à avoir des regards croisés sur l'Iran, essentiellement des regards américains et français, et canadiens. C'est l'autre continent, le continent lointain pour nous. Comment voit-il l'Iran à un moment particulièrement crucial de notre histoire? Il de vous rappeler tout ce qui vient de se passer et qui est peut-être en train de se passer au moment où nous parlons, ce qui rend particulièrement important les travaux que nous allons faire. Voilà les quelques mots que je voulais dire. Je vais passer la parole à monsieur l'ambassadeur Lincoln Bloomfield. C'est lui qui organisera les 3 tables rondes qui vont diviser notre journée. Et je lui souhaite bon vent et bon courage. Et je vous souhaite à tous un après-midi fructueux. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup.
Au revoir, monsieur. Je vais aller me mettre là-bas.
Mr. Colombe, thank you to FEMO for the invitation on behalf of our panel and the 2 panels to follow. We're honored to be able to be with all of you this afternoon and to discuss issues pertaining to Iran from several perspectives. This first panel is a broad discussion, an open-ended discussion of policy toward Iran. And I want to be creative and ask our panelists a little bit about Iran's policy as we have perceived it toward all of us, whether it's the European views, Canadian views, American views. I am joined by an extremely distinguished group of well-known, notable political and policy experts. And I'm going to start from my right, your left. We have John Baird, the former Foreign Minister of Canada. We have former Senator Joseph Lieberman, former vice presidential candidate. We have Ambassador Robert Joseph, the former Undersecretary of State and Special Envoy for Nuclear Non-Proliferation, one of America's leading experts on nuclear policy issues. We have General Jack Keane, the former Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army and a very well-recognized senior military expert in the United States. And our friend Bruno Tertrais, the Deputy Director of the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique de France. So we're very pleased to have all of you. I think we should perhaps just start from one side to the other with Minister Baird and invite each of our panelists simply to reflect on where we stand today in the middle of 2017. Many of you have been coming to the rally events for years, and how conditions have changed over the years. We're not talking anymore about terrorism lists, at least for the home team. We're talking about other people being put on terrorism lists. We're not talking about being threatened by mortars and terror and assassins and attacks at Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty. That danger has now passed. We are talking about the vulnerability of the regime in Iran. So the conversation has shifted quite a bit. And with it, so have governments in Canada and the United States and in Europe. So let me invite Minister Baird perhaps to start a conversation and reflect on some views on how do we talk about policy toward Iran and perceptions of Iran's treatment toward us. Let me just invite you to start us off.
Thank you very much for having me. I think we need to speak with greater moral clarity on
the threat that this regime poses, not just to the Iranian people itself, each and every day, but to its neighbors. I completely reject the previous U.S. administration's leadership trying to engage and appease at all cost. I think that sends a terrible message to the people of Iran. I think if you look at the whole notion of Rouhani as a moderate and the propagation of that myth, not just by the lobbyists for the mullahs and the regime, but frankly by a lot of Western leaders, a lot of Western governments. I can remember being in the Canadian Parliament and getting a question from the Liberal Party in opposition, saying, weren't we going to work with the newly elected government in Iran? And I said it was illegitimate, and they were aghast. And I said, well, how could any presidential election be legitimate when, number one, 51% of the population weren't even allowed to stand for election, let alone having to be endorsed by a panel of the mullahs to even stand as a candidate. So I think first and foremost we need to speak with greater moral clarity. I think the terms of political discourse are tremendously important. And one final opening comment is I've seen in the last 5 years, 6 years, so many people who I admire and respect literally pushing people aside to try to embrace Rouhani when he first visited the UN as president, or the number of, again, people who I respect and admire, flying in to kiss the ring in Tehran with large business delegations. And I think, frankly, we must be a lot stronger than that. It's not all about the almighty dollar and about the advancement of a nation's commercial interests. The people of Iran are watching, and they will remember who stood by them and who lacked the strength of the courage of their convictions.
Thank you very much, Minister. Senator Lieberman, your reflections?
Thanks, Lincoln. It's great to be back here. And I want to pick up the mood of your opening remarks and say that as we gather here for this annual coming together of what I would call the forces fighting for freedom for the people of Iran, I think we can have some sense of optimism that events are moving in the direction of our moral cause. And I say that both because of events external to Iran and also what's happening in Iran. And in this opening statement, I'll be brief. The first, I think, very significant change is the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. I supported Hillary Clinton, so understand that I'm speaking about the policy toward Iran and the Middle East. Because for the last 8 years, we had an administration in Washington whose policy toward the East was to have a kind of benign, friendly relationship with our traditional allies, Israel and the Arab world, but to be focused on Iran, to be focused on trying to improve our relations with Iran, frankly, almost regardless of what Iran was doing. And it was targeted at the Iran nuclear agreement, which, of course, most of it, I speak for myself, felt was a bad agreement based on all that we had all put into sanctions and the rest. It didn't end the Iranian nuclear program. It gave them an enormous amount of cash. And it did not, it was, as somebody else has said, transactional. It was about a kind of a deal. It wasn't transformational. In fact, nothing about Iran's behavior has changed in the couple of years since the Iran nuclear agreement was signed. It continues to be, by judgment of the U.S. State Department, the government in the world that most supports terrorism. It continues to feed and fuel warfare and terrible human suffering throughout the region, all of which is aimed at extending its own power. I'm speaking about obviously Syria, from Syria to Yemen, and a lot of places in between and beyond that. So from this administration of the previous 8 years, which was, I might say, Iran-centered, and nothing has ended up being changed, we come to an administration now where President Trump has quite clearly said that two things. One is, essentially, we know who our friends are in the Middle East, and we know who our enemies are. And our enemies are Iran. We're not making that up. I mean, all you have to do is listen to the Supreme Leader and others, death to America. And the Islamic State is the second enemy. And we have friends in the Middle East, and those are the Gulf Arab countries and Israel. And I hope, as the policy review that the administration is doing now of its policy in Iran, we also acknowledge more explicitly that we have another group of friends and allies in the Middle East, and that is the people of Iran. And that is the resistance to the regime in Iran, which is represented by the organizations that come together for this weekend. Inside Iran, there are changes occurring. The fact is the economy is still terrible. One thing that's not changed is that the Supreme Leader and the IRGC are still the ultimate control. As the Prime Minister said, you can say there are elections, but when the Supreme Leader decides who runs for president and approves Rouhani before he could run, you have to ask how independent he will be. And yet now, as you may have seen if you've been following recent days and weeks in Iran, Rouhani has actually begun to say some independent things, and the Supreme Leader recently warned Rouhani, and said that he should keep in mind that he could be sent into exile, the way previous leaders, presumably thinking of Bani Sadr, were. So I take this to be a sign of instability in Iran. And the other part of it is, of course, the more open expression of support for the resistance, including for the MEK, specifically around the unprecedented public discussion in the last year or so of the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in Iran, most of whom were MEK members in 1988. It's a remarkably bold thing to be talking about publicly. Obviously, it requires, using the South African example, a truth commission. Don't expect it from this government, but the very fact that people are demanding it now says that there is the kind of unrest that can lead to the ultimate answer to this problem, which is the end of the regime in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Just a factual point, Geoffrey Robertson, the British human rights lawyer who investigated and reported on the 1988 massacre, said it was worse than the Bataan Death March and the Srebrenica massacre, just to put it in perspective. So let me turn to Ambassador Joseph for your reflections.
Good afternoon, Link, thank you, and let me also thank the organizers for including me in this event. What I'd like to do is drill a little bit deeper and look at the Iran issue more broadly from a counterproliferation or non-proliferation perspective, because despite the hype both here in Europe and in the United States that's been given to the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, Iran continues to pursue nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. The ballistic missiles are very obvious. They're in the open, or at least many of the programs are in the open, whereas the nuclear capacity, I think, is a bit more opaque, but nevertheless still there, because we shouldn't kid ourselves. I think it was Olli Heinonen, who is an IAEA inspector, said that if Iran doesn't have a covert nuclear program today. It will be the first time in 30 years that it hasn't had one. And we know, I think, from the revelations that were made available in Washington over the course of the last 3 weeks by the resistance, by NICRI, that both the missile and the nuclear programs continue unabated. But let me start with my conclusion, or my bottom line. And that is, it's essential to put the Iran proliferation challenge or threat in a broader context, in the context of the regime. Because it's really only that way that we will find a path forward for dealing with the regime. And when I say dealing with the regime in an effective way, it really means finding the best path to an end of the regime, because it's only when the regime ends that we will have been able to stop the ballistic missile and the nuclear programs. Iran today continues very aggressively to pursue both ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, although the latter is now sort of cloaked in this nuclear deal that lavishly rewards the regime for pretending that it's not pursuing nuclear weapons. Even, I think, the defenders of the JCPOA would have to agree that Iran retains the capability of sneaking out or breaking out of the agreement, and that at best this agreement represents only a pause. I've got a piece coming out in the National Review in the next couple days, and it's focused on North Korea and North Korea's proliferation programs. And while the mullahs in Tehran and the Kim dynasty are different, I think it can be useful to draw some parallels. For the past 25 years, in both cases, the United States, under both Democrat and Republican administrations, have based policy on myths. I think Farzan would call them mirages. And also, in addition to the myths, is this unfounded hope that we seek, seeking into our policy year after year, even with each successive failure that's made apparent by either a missile test or a nuclear test. And when those failures appear, we simply double down with the same old policy based on myth, based on misplaced hope. It's as once Samuel Johnson wrote about second marriages, it's the triumph of hope over experience. And it happens time and time and time again. And again, while Iran pretends that it is agreeing and abiding by the nuclear deal, and we pretend that we believe them, their ICBM program continues apace. And remember, there's only one reason for an ICBM program, and that is to put a nuclear weapon on the tip of it. With North Korea, the fundamental myth was that the regime would go away in 10 years. I heard this in 1994, I heard it in 2007, I heard it throughout the years of the Obama administration. The problem is the 10 years, well, it's always 10 years, and the regime doesn't go away. Throughout the years, though, in North Korea, we've shifted our policy from pursuing negotiations to sanctions to pressuring China, all designed to get North Korea back to the negotiating table. In fact, and this is what I argue in this piece to be published, focusing on negotiations has diluted our efforts to undermine a regime that is truly illegitimate and truly internally vulnerable. Regime change from within, and I always underline from within, is the key, and I would argue that it's the prerequisite to ending the nuclear and the missile programs. And our concessions in and outside of the negotiations with North Korea have only strengthened the regime and have had this perverted effect of perpetuating the very threats that we seek to end through the negotiations. So the parallels with Iran, and I'll be very brief, are striking. Iran is much different than North Korea. Iran is a real country. Iran has 3,000 years of history and a rich culture. But our policy has still been based not on sound thinking, not on experience, but on misplaced hope. And the misplaced hope in this case is not that Iran's going to go away, but that we will be able to find moderates within the government that will lead the government to a new and better place. And this is the myth that has been perpetuated for years and years. Again, the myth triumphing over hope, over reality. I think what we need to realize is that the regime itself is at the heart of the threat. The regime is the source of the nuclear and missile programs. The regime is the source of Iran's expansionist policies in Syria, Iraq, in Yemen, and elsewhere. And it is the source, very clearly, of the brutal internal domestic repression. This is a regime that will not change. It's a regime that cannot change, because if it begins to change, it will fall. Until the mullah's regime is brought down, we will not succeed in our efforts to end the proliferation challenge or to acquire more stability in the region. And here again, as in North Korea, the irony is that our misguided policies have only strengthened the regime in Tehran, providing it with the means to advance its proliferation programs, to intervene and foment disorder in neighboring countries, and to brutalize its own people, who are the first and foremost victims of the regime. The key in Iran, like in North Korea, is regime change from within, something that the Obama administration explicitly ruled out. How the Trump administration will deal with Iran is still an open question. I'm optimistic that this administration will continue to see Iran as a threat, both from a proliferation perspective as well as from a regional instability perspective, and will continue its efforts to build support within the region and to take firm action. But the test, or at least one test, will be whether or not the administration is willing to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization and to sanction that organization and its supporters. Remember what my boss once said about Iran, that it is the central banker of international terrorism. Well, the IRGC is certainly the chief teller of that banking system. So today we have press reports that say that the usual sort of alignments are taking place in the policy review. There are some that support regime change. There are some that support continuing the current policy, even though the latter is usually dressed up in much more harsh rhetoric. But it's basically the same. Who will win out? I really don't know. I do know that even if those who advocate regime change win out, it doesn't mean that the policy will be implemented. Going back to North Korea again, we did have the principals agree and the president agree on a firm policy of containment and regime change. But that wasn't implemented. It simply wasn't implemented, and we fell back on negotiations and serial concessions to ensure that the negotiations didn't fail, or at least would continue. Where we go from here, I think it's essential that if we're going to resolve the proliferation issue and the other challenges and threats we have from Iran, we do need to support internal change, again, regime change from within. We can't do this from without, but certainly we can support the opposition in Iran and those that support the opposition. We need to provide the opposition with hope and with sustenance in their long fight against this brutal regime. We need to support those opposition elements that favor, that advocate a non-nuclear, secular government. And we need to ensure that those who support more missiles, more instability, and more of a brutal crackdown on the Iranian people are isolated and ultimately removed. And I think this is the vision and this is the mandate of Madame Rajavi. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Well, General Keane, you're someone who watches very closely what's been happening inside Iraq and Syria. What's your perspective on Iran policy mid-2017?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I chair the Institute for the Study of War, and as a think tank in Washington, D.C., and we pay very close attention every single day to what is happening where conflict is in the Middle East, and also to what Russia is doing. To talk about Iran, I think for me, I'm a national security strategist. That's what I do. So I look at things in the context of the contours of change that are taking place in the world. And there's a number of them out there, just to mention a couple. We start with the Middle East. We know that the Middle East is a fractured region. It has a number of failed states now, 5. It's the breeding ground for radical Islam. ISIS, the fastest growing terrorist organization in the history of mankind, grew from several hundred fighters in 2012. By 2014, 30,000. Most of those were foreign fighters. They were not Iraqis, which gave birth to the initial group. They've spread to 30 countries. We're tracking every single year terrorist deaths, and the terrorist death count is now close to 30,000 on an annual basis. That's 5 times greater than what it was 10 years ago. In the Middle East also, Iran is seeking to dominate the region, as we all know, impose their will and influence on Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. At the same time, they're supporting insurgencies in just about every Sunni Arab state that is in the region. And the backdrop for what is happening in the Middle East is another contour of change that's taking place in the world. And while we began what's called the post-Cold War period in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it lasted for about 25 years. In those 25 years, we saw the United States as a primacy country because the world's only superpower. We had significant economic and military superiority during that period. And despite the rise of terrorism, despite humanitarian crisis, and Milosevic fighting 4 wars and losing all 4 of them in Europe, there was really no major threat to the international liberated order as we know it in the world. Today, that has fundamentally changed. Russia and China are making assaults on the liberated international order as we know it. We are back in the world of great power competition. And you can only understand what is happening in Iran and the Middle East. You have to understand that struggle, because it is going to be a larger struggle and it's going to impact the world as it has in the past. So the post-Cold War period that began in 1991 is over. That's the reality of it. During this period of time, American and European political will and moral courage and exercise in leadership was significantly eroded, which gave encouragement for the rise of Russia and China to begin to impose their will, at least internationally and eventually globally. Russia is attempting to become the most influential country in the Middle East, a status that the United States exclusively held. That's from outside the region. China wants to dominate Asia and the Pacific, and it has reversed the regional order to its favor. Not only that, they're seeking to be on a par with the United States in terms of global domination, and eventually they believe they will be the preeminent country in the world as they combine their very robust economy, eventually #1 economy, with their preeminent development of military power. A history lesson that they have learned from who? The United States. So those are the contours of change and things that are happening to us that impact how we think about Iran. The United States, which I can talk to a little bit more clarity about, I'll leave the European situation to Europeans, but the United States has gone through an identity crisis in the last number of years. Identity crisis over are we an exceptional country or not? We had guilt feelings about past policy failures disproportionately to what we normally have. And countries make mistakes just like Europeans. They usually learn from them and move on. But we had trouble with that. So much so that those feelings about America, and people began to have some doubts about it, ushered in a political outsider who was espousing national populism, and the only one truly doing it in the campaign among Republicans and certainly a Democrat, advocating a major change. And as a result of that, the main components of that campaign was to make America great again, as you well know, and America first. That resonated with an American population to a degree that we have a new president who is a complete outsider with no internal political experience or foreign policy experience, which is not unusual for American presidents. Most of them come to that office without much foreign policy experience. Let me just say a couple of things about this administration, because I was offered to be in a part of it, and for personal reasons I could not. So I've had discussions with this president, one lengthy and one not so lengthy, and then a number of discussions with his national security team. Let me just say this about him. In discussing national security and foreign policy, he recognizes that this is an area where he doesn't know much about. So he is a very good listener, has excellent questions about it, and has a thirst to learn and grow in an area where he has no knowledge. Certainly his strength as an American leader is, one, is in leadership, and two, is dealing with the economy and what needs to be done there. But secondly, and I think it says something about him, is that he selected a very strong national security team around him. Many of us who have been observing this for years, apolitically, and I'm speaking apolitically here, I provided advice to Clinton for 10 years as a national security advisor, although I totally disagree with the politics. That can be attributed. And I provided advice to 4 or 5 Republican candidates who were running in this last time on national security. So I try to be apolitical when I make these comments. But this national security team is excellent. They have experience, they have knowledge, and they have some confidence about themselves in doing it. So that give them some credit for that. There is no national security or foreign policy strategy from this administration yet. I don't think there's a Trump doctrine, but what they have, and they are developing a national security strategy, they're writing it as I speak. But what has happened in the first 5 or 6 months of the administration, I told this to the president, I said, listen, no matter what domestic agenda you have, that is going to be sidelined to a certain degree because the world comes to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Its problems come to your doorstep. And it happened for every single president from World War II on to the present. And it takes you off some of your agenda. And that began almost immediately. So here, I think what has evolved, if you watch the policy and you watch the actions that are taking place, this is my personal view of what is happening, is that President Trump is returning American leadership to the world stage as a global leader seeking stability, security, and prosperity. It is a traditional and historical role that every single president we have had since World War II advocated, whether they be Democrat or Republican, except for one, and that happened to be our last president. The second thing that is happening, he has sent his government officials, and he's done it himself, to reassure our allies that the United States is going to exercise a leadership role. We will partner with you, and if we're in an alliance with you, we will stand by that alliance, and if we're not in an alliance with you, you can count on us as a strategic partner. In other words, in American words, we've got your back. He sent Mattis to the Far East on the 3rd day that Mattis was in office to reassure South Korea and the Japanese that we are going to change the policy dealing with North Korea. We will reject the policy of strategic patience of the previous administration. We are willing to confront the North Koreans, and we're willing to put pressure on the Chinese. He sent his emissaries, Vice President Pence, Secretary of Defense Mattis, Secretary of State Tillerson, and the Secretary of Homeland Security Kelly to Europe to do much the same thing. Tillerson and Mattis have been here on multiple occasions now with the same issue. We're in NATO. We're not leaving NATO. We want you to pay your fair share. We got your back. We understand Russia is confronting us in this region here, and we are going to deal with it despite all the political hype in the United States about Russia and the administration and all the rest of this. Judge them by what they are doing and what they are saying and what actions they're doing. And then finally, he chooses, much to my surprise, he chooses the Middle East as his first place to visit. It is an historic visit. In a room larger than this, he had 55 leaders in that room. And he made a couple of significant points to them. He said, number one, we are going to stand together against the threats in this region. The number one strategic threat in the region is Iran, who is imposing their will on this region, and we will stand together and we will stand against that threat. We will counter that threat. Now that is a reversal, 100%, of a policy of accommodation and appeasement of Iran by his predecessor. That's a total rejection of that policy. Second thing he said, the second threat here is radical Islam. He used Islamic extremism as the word. You know what I'm talking about here, regardless of what words we're using. And he said, we need to do a number of things here. One, you need to drive it out of your mosques, drive it out of your education centers, drive it out of places where they gather. That's number one. Number two, you need to stop having your citizens finance these radical Islamists. You know that is going on. Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, people in the Middle East financing that. And we know what countries these people come from. And number three, and I was surprised and elated that he said this. He says, listen, at the end of the day, this is a religious and political ideology that's being fought inside the religion of Islam. He said, we in the United States cannot undermine that ideology. Only you can do that. Only you can offer an alternative to these young people who are attracted to this radicalization because they want to live a life of purpose and meaning. You have to do that. But we will stand behind you. And when force is necessary to be used, then we will help you with that if you need that kind of help. I think that kind of encouragement from the president made an historic statement about his commitment to the Middle East in terms of stability and security. And then as a case comes to Iran, within 30 days in office, the Iranians fire a ballistic missile. Trump doesn't say, well, you shouldn't have done that, and let's have our foreign secretaries get together. He began to confront them immediately and sanctions them and calls them out, not just for the ballistic missile testing, which is in violation of UN resolutions. He calls them out for the thing that has troubled us the most since 1980, and that is their regional strategic objectives to dominate and control the entire region. And he says that those ambitions, we are going to confront you. And that is something the previous administration was never wanting to do. They put on the table initially that issue of strategic domination using proxies and fighters to control the region. The Iranians say, we won't come to the table if that's on the, we're only going to talk about nuclear weapons. And of course, our guys said, okay, and went to the table without it. That is the central issue. All right? So this is what I know. What I don't know is I don't know where the administration is on the nuclear deal. There's been pressure on them, certainly during the campaign, to walk away from it. But I do know this. They recognize, because we've had discussions, that they're in a deal with others. And you just can't act unilaterally. You're in there with other countries. You can act unilaterally, but what do you actually accomplish by acting unilaterally other than you feel good about it? You want to impose some behavior change. So they recognize that. They have another option that they could still bring it to the Senate and try to get the treaty ratified. The Senate, as it's composed right now, would reject it. So that's another option. So I don't think they have determined what they're going to do about the nuclear deal other than let it continue, hold Iran's feet to the fire. I do know, as a strategy, they want to deter Iran and they want to confront them and they want to change their behavior, similar to what they intend to do with Russia and with North Korea and China. And all of those require intensive, integrated, comprehensive strategies to do that. But what I don't know is what we've discussed here already, is if they would make a strategic move to undermine the regime to the point that it would be overthrown. I don't know if that is a strategy or not. And they're 5 months, 6 months into an administration. So they're formulating strategies dealing with all of these complicated issues that I tried to give you the context in which we're trying to deal with Iran, and I'll just end on that. Thank you.
Thanks, General. Bruno Tertrais, you've been hearing views from North America, perhaps a perspective from Europe.
Well, it turns out that there's not one single perspective about the Islamic Republic in Europe. In fact, there are many, but let me note one thing to begin with. I find it very interesting that discussing the policies of the Islamic Republic has practically, has almost left the public stage since the nuclear deal of 2015. There's a lot of implicit thinking in Europe that goes along the lines of problem solved. Problem solved. Now, the problem is that a lot of it is in good faith. Many people on this continent, including in this country, believe that we have solved the Iranian problem, quote unquote, because the nuclear deal is supposed to be solved. Iran will be reintegrated in the international community, whatever that means. But that's the usual. Those are the usual words. And I think there is a lot of naivete in Europe about the Islamic Republic. Don't get me wrong, I'm not referring to what people in the intelligence services or in the defense ministries or some foreign ministries who really look at Iran, including on the nuclear issue, and know what they're talking about. I'm talking about the broader policy elite debates. Even those who criticize the deal are often, relieved or happy that, we can, quote unquote, move on. Hey, after all, it's supposed to be a win-win. We're supposed to do business, which is good, and that business is also supposed to help Iran becoming a, quote, good citizen of the world, unquote. So it's a win-win, all right? And I insist on the fact that you may call this misguided thinking, but it's pretty sincere. That's the reason why I call it naive. Now, Iran's message, the Islamic Republic's message to Europe these days tends to be very simple. You Europeans have to step in. We can't count on the United States. The Trump administration is out there to stop the implementation of the deal. You have to step in. Your banks have to guarantee the business of your firms with us. They're pleading, literally, Europeans to step in. I'm using the word step in 3 times because I recently heard a high-level Iranian official use it. Now, is this going to work? I think that in European governments, I'm not talking about the policy elite at large, but in European governments, there's still some sanity prevailing. Not everywhere, but I think that in this country, in particular, even though we are playing along with the deal, hey, we're a signatory to the deal, there are very few illusions about what's possible to achieve with it. But what I find troubling is that so few people in my country and in Europe overall tend to see Iran as a problem for the region. The narrative over the past 5 years, 2 years in particular, has tended to be the following. We Europeans, just like many other countries in the world, are the victims of jihadi terrorism. And the principal source of jihadi terrorism are the Gulf monarchies. There goes the narrative. Therefore, because it's some stupid, zero-sum gaming geopolitics. Zero-sum gaming is the 0 degree of geopolitics, okay? But that's, unfortunately, still the way a lot of people see the situation in the Middle East or in many parts of the world. Therefore, if Saudi Arabia and Qatar and others are the problem, we have to get closer to Iran. Iran, after all, is close to be a democracy. Has been close to be a democracy for a long time, by the way. It's like thinking about the future of the North Korean regime. Oh, hey, in 10 years, it'll be a better place. Now, as Bob reminded us, this is what people said in 84, 94, 2004, and 2014. It's not getting a better place. Now, Iran, for all the talk about liberalization and moderation, what we see, and I don't need to remind this audience, is that contrast between, a very educated, eager to see the world and get in touch with the world population, and a deep state, a security apparatus, which is as repressive as ever, and which, unfortunately, acts against European interest in the Middle East. This is what is really troubling, is that this is something that a lot of people don't see. Europeans tend to have short memories, unfortunately. We French sometimes forget, and again, I'm not talking about people in the know, but French public opinion would be surprised if I reminded them how much we were victims of Iranian-backed or Iranian-sponsored terrorism in the 80s, for instance. Okay? They don't even remember that. Same regime. And sometimes same people, by the way. They confuse moderation and pragmatism. They think that a pragmatic attitude is a moderate attitude. It's a fundamental mistake. I accept the fact that some in the Iranian system, not necessarily the most powerful people today, but at least some powerful figures are acting as force of pragmatism. Pragmatism is not moderation. You can maintain the same ideology as a backbone and from a tactical standpoint, but with the same objectives, act differently. So this is what I find troubling. I view Iran in the Middle East as being the arsonist turned fireman. And there's a lot to be said about Iranian responsibility indirectly for the rise of Sunni jihadi terrorism. Okay? This is something that you don't often hear, unfortunately, in this country or in Europe. To his credit, President Macron, since we're in France and I'm French, has not, at this point in time, I think, has not said anything or acted in a way that would seem to imply that he is naive about the situation. I don't know what he thinks. I just noticed that Foreign Minister Zarif was hosted yesterday for a brief working visit in the Élysée this morning. Maybe it's Mr. Zarif's plane that we can hear over there. I hope it doesn't crash. Not here. It may crash. But that visit was not publicized in a way that seemed to imply any kind of political messaging. So it's difficult to say what President Macron's policies vis-à-vis Iran will be. But knowing what kind of a character he is, I would be very surprised if he had the same kind of naivete that I denounced earlier on.
Thank you very much. We will have time to turn to the audience for questions, but before we do that, I want to challenge this panel. It strikes me that every one of our panelists has encountered back in their home country people who have a different view, and they may believe different facts, whether it's that accommodation with Iran was the more moral policy, whether the elections in Iran were significant because allegedly so many people turned out, and there are questions about really what the turnout was, whether the nuclear agreement is being enforced. I go to think tank events where non-proliferation experts say the deal is being enforced and is being upheld. and whether trade with Iran will actually moderate the country. When we talk about sanctioning the Revolutionary Guards, the resistance has put out a compendium, a book that shows that 40 or 50% of the economy is run by holding companies under the military and retirement foundations. So would the United States be sanctioning European countries if they put the IRGC on the terrorism list? And so many issues of whether Iran is actually seeking domination or is doing what Foreign Minister Zarif would probably say, is being a good neighbor and is not being a divisive sectarian force at all. So, if you could counsel the exiled community and scholars around the world on how to educate populations in Canada, the United States, in Europe, what facts would turn this debate and confirm the analysis that you've brought forth? What is it that you would want to tell your sort of capital cities? What is it what is your frustration? What's the frustration in the United States Senate, where people just don't believe what other senators believe? They have two sets of facts. What do we do to overcome that? Minister?
I think first and foremost, we've got to abandon any notion of trying to restrain the evil regime from doing evil things. We've got to abandon a policy of containing the actions of the regime, and we must think more broadly of how do we overcome and how do we transform the governance in Iran, and what specifically can, not through foreign-imposed military-backed regime change, but what can we do to inspire and then tangibly support the people of Iran. I once spoke to Natan Sharansky, and he said one morning when he was sitting in a Soviet gulag, when Ronald Reagan called out the then Soviet Union for being an evil empire, that it did give them hope. It did inspire them. And I come back to the speaking with greater moral clarity. I think it's so incredibly important. We must be much, much more ambitious than simply trying to restrain and contain the regime.
Senator Lieberman?
The first argument I would make to doubters of where we are is that what happens in Iran, though it's half the world away from the United States, really matters to our security. It also matters to our values, but if people are skeptical about getting involved just because other people's freedom is being compromised by an autocratic regime as it is in Tehran and Iran, notwithstanding the mission that our founding documents, particularly the Declaration of Independence, gave us. Okay, let's say they're not going to buy that argument. But people in the Iranian diaspora have a personal connection to their homeland, as it were. So it has it's compelling to them. But I would argue to those who are on the other side of this in the United States, it ought to be compelling to us too in terms of our security. I mean, we got all the problems in the world today that General Keane talked about, rising big power competition with China and Russia. We have the insane regime in North Korea. But in my opinion, the most significant threat to world security and American security is the government in Iran today. And that is because it is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. It is creating havoc in the region. It has the blood of hundreds, thousands of Americans on its own hands, beginning with all the American soldiers who were killed in Iraq by IRGC-trained Shia militias. We can go back to the Marine barracks in Beirut in the 80s, to Khobar Towers. The line is a horrific one. So it's not like this thing is way over there. It's not going to affect Americans. It is going to affect Americans. And I thought Bob Joseph said something really compelling. Often the most simple statements are compelling. Not that you're simple-minded, but which
you never get to speak after you.
Right, which is, why do we think the government in Iran is building intercontinental ballistic missiles? They already can reach their enemies in the Arab states of Israel in the Middle East. They're building intercontinental missiles for one reason. So they'll be in a position to put nuclear weapons on them and to threaten, which will enfeeble Europe and the United States. And we can't let that happen. I mean, very personal. My wife was with me. When I think about the future and I think, what can I do to protect the security of my children and grandchildren in the decades ahead? In America, there's nothing more important than to change the regime in Tehran.
Thank you. Bob, thoughts on this?
Well, two points.
How do you carry the debate in Washington?
Well, the first is responding to your point that a good number, if not the majority, of those in the non-proliferation community.
Can you hear?
I'm innocent. I haven't touched it. So.
Move it up a bit.
So you didn't hear me the first time. My profound but simplistic statements.
I'm sure the mullahs heard you too.
Is that better? Yes. Okay, sorry about that.
I should have said it was a short statement, not simple.
Short and brilliant.
Brilliant. It was brilliant.
We won't prolong this. Two points. One in response to your observation that many, if not the majority, in the professional non-proliferation community of the United States do make the argument that the deal is being enforced. Well, there's an underlying sort of implicit implication that the deal solved the problem. Okay? Well, the deal didn't solve the problem. There is no effective verification. So we can't go, or the IAEA inspectors can't go to where the military-related activities or the suspected military-related activities had taken place, okay, in Parchin and elsewhere. We don't have a handle on their centrifuge modernization. So Iran is producing more and more advanced centrifuges that once the 10 years is up, they're free to produce as much fissile material as fast as they want to. I mean, even President Obama talked about zero breakout time at the end of this agreement. And as for the possible or potential military activities that the IAEA highlighted in November 2011, a whole list of 12 items that were all suspected to be related to a nuclear weapons program, well, that was swept under the rug. So the deal, is not a good deal. The deal doesn't solve the problem. And in terms of enforcement, well, I really don't think it is being enforced. And I didn't even mention the missiles not being covered under the deal. But the deal, I think is being violated, and I think that some of the material, some of the information that's been released by NICRI makes that argument and makes it very effectively. And my personal sense is that cheating is in the DNA of this regime. They are going to cheat. There's just no question, because we have a perfect track record of that. It's like North Korea. I mean, many in that same community argued that the agreed framework was being observed by the North Koreans. Well, it wasn't. They started a whole second path for the enrichment of uranium. Yes, they did shut down their reprocessing facility, but they started a whole nother path that we denied for many years. So I'm skeptical of this sort of argument about the deal being enforced on a number of grounds. And second, just in terms of regime change, I always say very quickly, regime change from within. Okay, we don't do regime change from without very well. Okay, we've got some experience. We don't have any positive experience, at least not in the last good number of years to support that. But with sanctions, with a containment policy that we used against an advocate for over 50 years, the Soviet Union, we didn't provoke military conflict. but we contained them. We denied them certain capabilities. Look, the Mullah's regime, in my view, is a brittle regime. It is a regime that lacks legitimacy. It is a regime that relies on brutalizing its people to stay in power. I think there's little doubt that at some point there will be a spark, there will be a turning point, and you'll see the same phenomenon that you did with Ceausescu's Romania. It'll go away quickly. It's hard to predict when that's coming, but the last thing we ought to be doing, the last thing we should be doing is rewarding this regime, is lavishly rewarding them with hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, hundreds of billions over time, so that they can provide, their missileers and their nuclear community more money, so that they can intervene in Iraq and in Syria and in Yemen and throughout the Middle East, as my colleagues have made clear. The first rule is do no harm. But sound policy, I think, would dictate an active regime change from within, that is, support the opposition approach to these issues.
Thank you, Bob. Just a factual point, Ambassador Bob Gallucci, who was involved in the '94 North Korea negotiation, wrote an op-ed during the Iran talks and said the one failure that they shouldn't repeat is to have a plan in hand if Iran cheats. They didn't have a plan B if North Korea cheated, and that was his one criticism of their approach, and I'm not sure we took his advice.
And just a footnote to that, Bob was one of the people that in 1994 assured me that in 10 years we wouldn't have to worry about North Korea.
Well, and point taken. General Keane, I know for a fact that you follow the tactical action inside Syria and Iraq. You gave us a very strong strategic view. Iran has many people convinced that they are fighting ISIS, that they are trying to keep stability in the Middle East, that they're a good neighbor. What would you want Washington to understand that they don't seem to get about Iran's sectarian role in neighboring countries?
Iran since 1980, and it has said it every single year since then, and they are very consistent in their strategic objective, which is to spread the Islamic revolution throughout the region and dominate and control the region. And to accomplish that, they have to do two major things. One is drive the United States out of the region, and that is why, beginning in 1980, as Senator Lieberman mentioned, they began to kill us. They used their proxies, the Hezbollah, to do it. They blew up embassy in Lebanon, the Lebanon annex when we moved there. They blew up our Marine barracks. They blew up the Kuwait embassy. They blew up our Air Force barracks in Saudi Arabia. Guess what? A Republican president pulled us out of Lebanon. And also we pulled out of Saudi Arabia a year after they blew up our barracks. And then we were involved in the war in Iraq, and they came in there with advanced IED devices that could kill any American vehicle on the battlefield. They told their proxy, the Iraqi Shia militia, who they trained at 2 training bases in Iran, to use these weapons only on Americans. So they've killed close to 2,000 of us since 1980. So you're talking to Americans, give them those facts. Because I agree with my friend here, we have a tendency to forget these things. We've got short memory. This is horrific behavior. They had a 10-year hostage-taking campaign that nearly brought down the Reagan presidency, because we were going to trade TOW missiles for hostages that Iran had of Americans. Remember that one? People have a tendency to forget that. So where are they now? Well, they're as aggressive now as they have ever been, but they're even more so. And here's what they're doing. They want to build a land bridge from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, to the Mediterranean. And they are about that. They thought they were in pretty good shape until the Arab Spring came in 2010, and the Middle East exploded. When people were seeking political and social justice and economic opportunity, they went into the streets. As we all know what happened. Some cases that succeeded in Tunisia, and some other places it did not. In Syria, they were in the streets. And early on, it looked like the Assad regime would in fact be toppled. In fact, many experts were predicting it within 6 months or a year. What changed? Iran. Iran motivated the Russians to get involved. Qasem Soleimani visited there, and they came in all in because they could not lose their client state. And they have been about this with serious commitment to ensure that the Assad regime is propped up. To that degree, in 2015, the opposition force once again was able to create some momentum to their favor. They were encroaching on the Alawite enclave, which is in the northwestern corner of Syria. And that alarmed the Iranians. 2 visits to Moscow. And as a result of those visits, the Russians conduct the first out-of-region military intervention in 35 years. The last one was Afghanistan, and you know how that turned out. And they came into Syria with 55, 60 airplanes to conduct a military intervention and support the ground forces. Now listen to me. The ground forces in Syria are not run by Syrian generals. They're run by Iranian generals. They're on the ground. They do this every single day. They are in charge of the campaign. They decide where the Syrian air power attacks in support of those ground operations and where Russian air power attacks in support of those ground operations. The Russians do some independent attacks away from those ground assaults on their own, but they're coordinated with the Iranian generals. They have lost 2 Iranian generals on the ground. They have somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 to 9,000 Hezbollah fighting there with them. They have thousands of Iraqi, listen to this, Iraqi Shia militia fighting with them, even though the Iraqi Shia militia are fighting ISIS. But this is how important this is to them. These are all the ones that were trained by them at 2 training bases inside Iran. Another fact, they committed for the first time since the Islamic State was formed in 1980, some conventional military units to this fight. Never done before. Now, some of those are out of there because they took so much casualties. There's a fierce fight that goes on the ground. The opposition force, which you probably don't hear much about, they're moderates and they're also radicals, but they're fighting for their neighborhoods, their communities, their families, their children, their grandchildren, and they're tenacious, and they will not give this fight up. That is why from the time the Russians came in September 2015, it took more than a year for them to retake Aleppo. They thought, the Russian generals thought this was going to go over in about 90 days. A year later. Why? Because of the opposition forces' tenacity, because of what their motivation is. They have all lost their families to a certain degree. They've lost their friends. They believe this is a fight to the end for them. Now, what has happened is the Iranians and the Russians have successfully intervened to the degree now that Assad regime is in power indefinitely. There is nothing the European leaders are going to do and nothing the United States leaders are going to do politically to change that fact. They're not going to come out and tell us that, but that is the reality of what that military intervention by Russia has done and what the ground force intervention that the Iranians have achieved. Now, what the struggle is right now inside Syria is this. If you remember what Syria looks like, it sort of runs down through the middle of Syria in the Euphrates River, and it heads towards the southeast from Turkey, all right, out of the mountains in Turkey. What the struggle is for everything east of that river. The Russians, the Iranians, and the Syrians believe, with some exceptions, where Al-Qaeda is and some Syrian moderates in the south, Al-Qaeda enclaves in the north, they think they own most of everything to the west. What they're concerned about is ISIS is east of that river. And they're concerned about the post-ISIS outcome, which could be unfavorable to them. What they don't want is the United States-led coalition that is taking down ISIS in Raqqa and the environs around it would own that territory in the post-ISIS era, therefore establishing a legitimate block to the Iranians for this land bridge that they want from Iran all the way to the Mediterranean. That is the strategic issue that is going on in Syria right now. That is why you saw ground forces, Syrian air forces attacking U.S.-led coalition on the ground and in the air for that very reason. And some of that is why 2 Iranian drones were going to a base that we have in the southeast corner of Syria. And as it got close to that base, our guys shot them down. It's also why we took out a convoy that was heading in that direction. We don't know whether they were Hezbollah in there or Iraqi Shia militia. We suspect maybe both, but we don't know for sure. And we had to take out that whole convoy. So that struggle is going to continue. And I don't know, I'm just being honest with you here, I don't know what the Trump administration is thinking in terms of they understand the seriousness of this Iranian threat in eastern Syria, number one. Number two, what strategy do they have to oppose that threat? Because gives us a unique opportunity to cut that land bridge in half. The other thing I said, the number one strategic objective is to drive us out of the region. The second objective, and it always has been, is destroy the state of Israel. If you were sitting in Israel today and you were talking to national security folks, they are working closer to Arabs than they have ever had in their history. Every single year, they get closer to them. Why is this? One reason only, Iran. Iran is driving the whole destabilization of the region. If you sit in Israel, they already have, Iranians have given, listen to me now, the Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets and missiles. Hamas in western part of Israel has 10,000, and you just saw a couple of years ago them using some of those. If this land bridge is able to be formed where they effectively want to do it in Syria, then you're going to have Iran right there in Syria across the border with whatever they want to put in place militarily that they could use their proxies to attack Israel. So if you're sitting in Israel, you're looking at this and you are being encroached on. And this is a major strategic security issue for them, and that is why they are talking to the Sunnis. Now, what I think we should do in that eastern part of that, we just once and for all solve this problem. And that is get the Arabs in the region, who I know for a fact, because I've talked to them, would do it, with some U.S. forces and go into the eastern part of Euphrates and just clean that whole thing up. All right? It's easy to talk about. It's always harder to do. But stabilize the place. Stabilize it to thwart. This is about Iran. This is not about the Assad regime. This is about Iran. And that's what we have to do. Whether we will do that or not, I don't know. I think there's a reluctance on the part of the administration after 16 years of war in the Middle East to commit more troops for all the obvious reasons that we go through in the United States and Europe over such a thing. But I think it's a strategic imperative if we're going to stop Iran and the security threat that would represent to the region at large.
Thanks, General. I'm going to turn to Bruno, and we're running a little short of time, so I'll ask the organizers whether we want a question or two before we finish, or maybe a final comment so you can let me know what you'd prefer. Bruno, you're hearing some very urgent timetables. The sand is going through the hourglass on the nuclear capability, on Iran's strategic move to impose much greater threats on Israel, on the region, and on Europe and North America. Do people think about that in Europe? Are they conscious of sort of geopolitical tectonic moves which pose a longer-term threat? I know you mentioned Foreign Minister Zarif. Most people in Washington think that he's the equivalent of the U.S. Secretary of State, but as we were talking before, he has none of the same kind of authorities and even ambassadors in the field that the U.S. Secretary of State would have. And Mr. Rouhani doesn't seem to come into the conversation when we talk about the tactical situation in the Levant or the nuclear program. He seems to have nothing to do with it. So perhaps a perspective on what you've heard from a European view.
Let me put it this way. You asked us, Lincoln, you asked a simple question. What can we do for people to better understand what's at stake here? And I was scribbling a few lines, what I call that may pass or may not pass the T-shirt test. Some simple sentences that you can put on a T-shirt. Okay, slogans. One, let me give you four. One is that the idea that trade brings moderation has not been proven historically. Okay, that doesn't make for a very nice T-shirt, but you're getting my point. I wouldn't buy that T-shirt. I wouldn't be. But you know what I mean. Two, the Middle East is not a place for zero-sum gaming. There is as much sectarian violence on the so-called Shia side, Persian/Shia side, than on the Sunni/Arab side. And that's something that unfortunately many, there is no, violence has no religion, if I can put it this way. The behavior of Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and in Syria and in other places of war is certainly no better than many so-called Sunni militias. Iran is propping up a regime, the Syrian regime, which has been fighting the French interests. I'm not talking about distant history. I'm not talking about the 80s. I'm talking about the Bashar al-Assad regime, okay, which has been actively fighting our own national interests in Lebanon, for instance. But most importantly, I accept the idea that the Islamic Republic considers Daesh, ISIS as a threat and is actively fighting it. I accept that. Except that I said that it was also the arsonist and fireman. But most importantly, by propping up the Syrian regime, Iran is actually reinforces ISIS on the longer run, because the best friend, as surprising as it still sounds to many European ears and maybe some American ears, the best friend of ISIS is actually Bashar al-Assad. It's two faces of the same coin. So Iran may claim and actually does fight ISIS. I accept it. We have to accept it. But if you prop up the Assad regime at the same time, in the end, you end up reinforcing Sunni jihadism, Daesh ISIS type. Finally, one word on the nuclear front. You're completely right. 10 years by diplomatic standards is a short period of time. By nuclear program standards is a very short period of time. Now, I accept it when my diplomat friends from Europe and the United States say, hey, we're buying 10 years. I say, okay, time is a precious commodity in international diplomacy, and 10 years is nothing. But hey, we've already passed 2 years, okay? Only 8 years to go. And Iran is not showing the behavior of a country which has given up for good the nuclear option. This is fundamental. I'm ready to give the Islamic Republic of Iran a chance. But Iran is not South Africa, okay? The IAEA is not in a position to draw a so-called broad conclusion about the peaceful nature of the nuclear program. I accept the hypothesis, okay, if one tells me, if Iran says, if the IAEA says, well, okay, let's change the behavior here, and if all the Iranian signals were, okay, you know what, we had a nuclear option, we had a nuclear weapons program, but we've decided that it was no longer in our interest. I said, okay, show it. There are very simple ways, and Bob knows that very well. There are simple ways, technical ways to show that, okay? Your good faith, just as South Africa, for instance. Iran is not showing that behavior, okay? And finally, on the sanctions that are supposed to be the big deterrent in the deal, the idea that don't worry if Iran is violating the deal, we'll reimpose sanctions. But that's the problem. You see, Iran is testing the deal, Iran is pushing the envelope, and now we have a fundamental contradiction, because if our idea is to massively reinforce trade with Iran as to lock up Iran in an interdependency relationship, then how credible would be our threat of reinstating sanctions, because we would be shooting ourselves not in the foot, but in 2 feet.
All right. Now, I owe the organizers to keep on time because we have 2 more fascinating panels to go. I'm going to ask the panelists if anyone has a last lightning shot that they'd like to put out. Minister.
I think people in the mass publics and their governments in the West need to understand that the Iranian people are on a completely different page than the mullahs and their leaders. Jim Zogby, the president of the American Arab Institute, is also a very well-respected pollster. He has done public opinion research across the Middle East. And other than Israel, the mass public on the ground in Iran are very pro-America because they do share many of the same values. And we must put them in our sights in terms of what this inspires us in terms of public policy in this regard.
Thank you. Senator?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, what John has just said is in kind of evocation of possibilities of the future, because it is true on the polls that you see that the two countries in the Middle East where, among the people, America is most popular are Israel and Iran. So we may hope for a day when that can be expressed in better relations. But I want to say this quickly. I said at the beginning of my opening remarks that as we gather here this year, we look back at the last year, there's a lot of reason for encouragement about the cause we have, which is freedom for the people of Iran. The first, to repeat, shouldn't be taken for granted, is the change from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, which on Iran and the Middle East is a change from night to day, from a long night of a mistaken and I think naive, maybe well-intentioned policy that they could somehow change Iran. They didn't. And in doing so, ignoring our allies there, Israel and the Arab states. But the second thing, which we have not talked about that's happened in the last year, is, and it's been led by the rise of a new leadership in Saudi Arabia, now Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is an activation of the Arab world against their enemies, including the Saudis, who have always been a conservative power, hesitant to be active diplomatically, militarily. It's a new day, baby. And that is good news for the people of Iran, because the Arab states have said exactly what the President of the United States has said. We have two threats to our future, our security, and those are one, Iran, and two, the radical extremist Islamist terrorists. So we've got the coming together in an unprecedented way of forces that support the cause that these groups have been fighting for decades. And that, again, is freedom for the people of Iran.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Just three very, very quick points. First, on Bruno's point about buying 10 years. Of course, they may cheat, and that would reduce that time. But more strategically, okay, 10 years. Okay, the issue is, what do you do in those 10 years to change the environment? Because if in 10 years or 8 years from now, we have the same regime, but now with an abundance of fissile material for nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, including ICBMs, that wasn't very, a very good deal for us, buying 10 years. Second point, on the issue of Afghanistan that Jack mentioned, I can tell you that this is all about power. One of the first meetings I attended with President Putin when I was on the NSC staff was in the Kremlin. There were just four of us around the table. I was taking notes as the NSC guy. But Putin, in October 2001, wanted to be our friend, and in those 2 hours, he talked about the strategic lessons from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. He never mentioned Ronald Reagan and Ronald Reagan's actions changing the dynamic. But it was very clear that this was all about power to him. And it's still about power. It's still about power to him, whether it's with Iran in the Middle East, or whether it's against Ukraine, or in the future, perhaps, I would say likely, against a NATO member. And with Obama, with President Obama, he had weakness. With President Trump, I hope it's an entirely different game. And third, I would just like to thank Senator Lieberman for all of the efforts and his leadership that he demonstrated on missile defense, on American missile defense programs. We've talked about the Iranian programs, the North Korean programs. Well, we're far from having a perfect defense. But we have much more of a defense because of you and your efforts. So thank you.
Thank you. Very nice of you. Can I draw a parallel from that? When we were fighting for a missile defense in the 90s, a lot of my colleagues said to me, you're a good guy, but you're totally off. You're kind of irrational here. You're talking about creating a system where a bullet can hit a bullet. How's that possible? Well, we did it. And the world is a lot safer. There's a lot of colleagues today who would say, you really think you can change the regime in Iran? You bet we could.
Good point. Hear her. Hear him.
Well, I think we're talking through your ability to ask us questions, so maybe when we finish here, if you want to ask us some questions personally, you can do that. A couple things. One is that what makes ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons so incredibly dangerous in North Korea and also Iran is that they are likely not persuadable by deterrence, which has held the world in nuclear peace, given the number of nations that now hold nuclear weapons. In other words, you use a nuclear weapon on your adversary, you're inviting the destruction of your entire regime. And we both know the motivation, in theory, for both of these regimes to have nuclear weapons is for the preservation of the regime. Well, if that's the case, then why do they want intercontinental ballistic missiles that would have nuclear weapons affixed to them so they can fire them someplace? That makes these regimes very, very dangerous, and obviously North Korea is much closer to this, and that's why our president is consumed by it. So that we have to keep in the back of our mind, how dangerous Iran can truly be, because they may not be persuadable by deterrence. I think that is true. The case, and it makes it a very, very dangerous country, as Senator Lieberman mentioned. The second thing is Iran's steadfast objective towards regional domination. It will be more aggressive, and we've already seen that. Remember, since the JCPOA began, and when we finalized it in July of 2015, Iran has successfully propped up the Assad regime, has absolutely directed the strategy of killing the people in the towns, villages, and areas from which the Syrian opposition forces come from. That is the primary target. They wholesale kill people. That is job one. And when the Russians came in with their penetrator bombs, they began to blow up the hospitals, which they were building underground because they destroyed 72% of all the hospitals. And the Russians used their penetrator bombs to blow up those hospitals systematically. It was the Iranians that came up with the idea of a starvation campaign for entire neighborhoods. We don't have to drop bombs on them, just don't let any food in. And I can show you pictures of people that look like something out of Auschwitz, that their bodies are laid out in warehouses. So the Iranians are steadfastly moving towards regional domination. They have, as I mentioned before, they have propped up this regime successfully. Since the JCPOA, they invaded using their proxies Yemen, and they toppled the regime. Now, thankful to Mohammed bin Salman from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Zayed from the Kingdom of UAE, both young people, both determined to deal with this threat. They have pushed back on it. We don't know where that outcome is going. What Iran wants, just so you understand strategically, there's nobody stupid in Iran. You know where Yemen is. They want the southern part of Yemen, a Navy base right there. There already is a base there. That's where we had the United States had a ship blown up. At that Navy base is the entrance to the Suez Canal. And they will put their anti-ship missiles and their mines in that area so they can impact strategically world trade as they impact strategically the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Hormuz. These objectives are not going to change. They will take the $100 billion windfall they got from the United States in removing sanctions and use most of that money, some of it certainly domestically, but most of that money to march towards these regional objectives. They are steadfast about it, and we're going to be on a major collision course, I think, with the Trump administration, because they will not back off of it.
Thank you. Bruno, you get the last word.
I think I fired all my bullets.
In that case, we have another panel coming on momentarily. I'll be back for the third panel, where I think we will come up with the resistance discussion. I'm sure we'll come up with a T-shirt that people will want to wear. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you.
Good job, Senator.
Thank you. Great to be with you. It is. I learned from you, really.
I knew he was good already, but you're great.